What's up guys, my name is Ace, and now that we've had a decent amount of time to get some gameplay with Black Ops 6, I wanted to share my number one gameplay complaint in the beta so far, and this is, unfortunately, spawns. Now typically with Treyarch, I don't worry too much about spawns. They tend to have the best handle on spawns out of any of the studios, and that's usually one big area I look forward to with Treyarch Call of Duty games, but unfortunately in the beta right now for Black Ops 6, the spawns are not in a good place. Now, I do think a small part of this is due to the crazy movement that we've got now, and people are getting around the map a lot quicker, and the faster you have people moving and the more that they're moving around the map, the harder it is to balance spawns. However, I definitely don't think that explains everything when it comes to the bad spawns. Another thing to point out here is the map design, at least with some of these maps in the beta, I think this is also putting a limitation on how good the spawns can be. Because with maps like Skyline and Derelict, for instance, there just doesn't seem to be enough room to be spawning people appropriately, and therefore you have to spawn them somewhere, and that somewhere is often not a good place. So I do want to point that out at the beginning. I don't think everything is necessarily the spawn logic's fault, and these two factors definitely come into play. But in saying that, after watching a whole lot of footage and focusing on nothing but spawns, and also just combining that with my experience playing the beta, it does look like they've unfortunately inherited the spawn system that arrived with Modern Warfare 2019. Like, I think it may be attached to this branch of the engine now, and this system is vastly inferior to the older spawn systems that Call of Duty used to have, especially Treyarch Call of Duties. So let's dive into this, and I'm going to separate this by mode, since the spawns do work a bit different depending on the mode you're playing. And the primary mode I wanted to share my feedback on here is Team Deathmatch, because with the beta build of the game where we have limited tools for testing things, TDM is probably the easiest mode to be judging the spawns on. And what I've noticed so far with Team Deathmatch is spawns seem to be very heavily based on keeping a distance from an enemy radius. Like, that seems to be almost entirely what is determining where players are spawning right now. Of course, I'm sure there are other factors mixed in, but I believe that's the heaviest weighted outside of line of sight. And I know, I'm sure you've seen people spawn in your line of sight, although probably not as much in TDM compared to the other modes. But what I've noticed with this style of a spawn system is this just has spawns flipping wildly, with people constantly spawning in pockets that form around the map. The problem with spawning people in pockets like this is these pockets are constantly changing. Again, especially when you combine it with the extra movement we've got this year, those pockets are constantly changing, which in my experience is often spreading players all over the map with no sense of flow or map control involved. Like, 1 second you have one teammate spawning on one side of the map, then the next second they're spawning on the complete opposite side of the map, then a second later they're now spawning on a totally different part of the map. What's the enemy team supposed to do about that situation when something like that happens? That's not reasonably predictable. And when you think about the flow that results in a situation like that, there isn't any. There's no flow there when people are just popping up all around you at all times. Now, ideally, when it comes to a spawn system in Call of Duty, you want it to be at least reasonably intuitive for even the average player out there. It should be pretty easy at any given moment to tell which side of the map is your side of the map and the side that your team is spawning on, and which side of the map the enemy team is spawning on. When you have those more strongly established end zones for your spawns, where one team is spawning on one side and therefore the other team is spawning on the other side of the map, and they don't flip unless you put a decent amount of pressure, and then when they do flip, it's a very big moment in the game, and it's kind of obvious that that happens, and it's not just going to flip-flop back and forth really quickly. When you have that, this makes for a much more predictable flow. You have fights that generally take place in that neutral zone in between those spawns. And even the average player out there knows the general direction, at least, that most of the enemies should be coming from at any given time. You'll rarely run into those situations where you just genuinely have no idea which direction the enemy could come from at any given moment, because they could be spawning in any direction at any given moment. And that's largely been my experience with the Black Ops 6 beta so far, for Team Deathmatch at least. Like, oftentimes it is fairly obvious and I know the general direction enemies are coming from, but far too often I run into situations where suddenly I have no idea what direction enemies could be coming from right now. And that's not a great feeling at all in Call of Duty, and I've been experiencing that far too much so far in the beta. So when it comes to Team Deathmatch, I'd love to see some more reliance on primary spawn locations on either end of the map, opposite to each other, with a bit more establishment toward that spawn where it requires a fair amount of pressure to force a flip on that. Now, obviously, that has to be tuned on a per map basis. You don't want extreme spawn trapping to take place or anything. But it shouldn't be flip-flopping back and forth on a moment-to-moment basis. A spawn flip should be a spawn flip. So those are my thoughts on spawns in TDM. A little more establishment I think could go a long way on that. Next, let's talk about domination. And I've got to say, out of all of the modes that are currently in the beta, domination's probably the best when it comes to spawns. but I still think there is room for improvement in Domination. And honestly, I have a pretty similar take here. I do think the spawns are a little bit flip-floppy in Domination, and I'd like to see that toned down a bit. The biggest thing I've noticed is it seems like one single player pushing up toward the enemy spawn can have too much of an influence, in my opinion at least, on a full-on spawn flip. So all you need is one guy pushing into their spawn area, and now suddenly their entire team is spawning behind you. And it's one thing if they're doing that and actually jumping on the enemy's point in Domination. At that point, I think it's reasonable enough to force a spawn flip. But even when they don't touch that point, I feel like it's often forcing that flip. And for me at least, again, I like seeing things established a little bit more, where if a single player decides to make that risky push into the enemy's spawn point, that should be fine. That shouldn't force a spawn flip because they're balancing risk versus reward for that move. Pushing alone into the enemy spawn is a high-risk maneuver because you're putting yourself in a situation where you now have enemies popping up around you. And many of those enemies, if you've recently killed them, they at least have a general idea of where you are and they're going to come hunting for you. So there's high risk attached to that, but then there's also the potential for high reward, where there's also a lot of potential kills if you can handle the pressure of all of those enemies that are popping up around you. This style of the spawn system allows for a lot more of those big moments to happen, because a lot of the times what I experience is you run to one side of the map, again, not even touching their point, you get a kill or two, and then you have to turn around because they're spawning all the way on the other side of the map. So then you turn around and you just do the same thing again without any really big moments happening. You're just getting a couple kills here or there, and the spawns keep flipping. Now, obviously, again, spawns need to flip if you have too many people pushing into them. If there's too much pressure there, you don't want extreme spawn trapping situations. And it is a fairly fine line, but at the moment, I feel they're just a bit on the flippy side for Domination. And I think the overall flow and general excitement with the gameplay could be improved if the spawns didn't flip quite as often as they currently are in Domination. Now, finally, for my spawn feedback, let's talk a little bit about Hardpoint. And with this one, the first thing I want to mention is I feel like there's a strange mix of sometimes being too trappy and sometimes being too flippy with Hardpoint. I think it really just depends on the map as well as the current active Hardpoint location. I think that's the type of thing where data needs to be collected on their end, and they'll likely make some adjustments there. Just as an example, on Derelict, for instance, there are some pretty heavy spawn traps that you can do in Hardpoint, where they definitely should be flipping or pushing out, and they're not. You'll just spawn in that same spot over and over again, and you don't really have too many options coming out of that spawn. This is also the map and mode where I've seen the most cases of literally watching somebody spawn in my sights, or vice versa, spawning in somebody else's sites. But then, like I said, on other maps, or even just other hardpoint locations, I find the spawns are just way too flippy, and they're just all over the place, to the point where, again, there's no real establishment of, that's their side of the hardpoint, this is my side of the hardpoint. This is something I've noticed a fair amount playing hardpoint in the beta. I'll spawn in and start making my way directly toward the hardpoint, only to find there's an enemy to my right or left who's doing the same thing. They just came out of spawn as well, and they're also making their way to the hardpoint, but we're running side by side to make our way there, and that isn't how spawns should be working in hardpoint generally. If one team is spawning on one side of the hardpoint location, then the other team's spawn should be on the exact opposite side of that. And the hardpoint should be at least roughly in between those locations, so that's where the clash and the fighting takes place, is at that hardpoint location, and not awkwardly shooting the guy to your left or right who happens to be running toward the hardpoint off spawn alongside you. Additionally, speaking about that hardpoint location being roughly in the middle between the two spawn points for each team, I've noticed on some maps, especially Rewind, there's some pretty extreme spawn imbalance when it comes to certain hardpoint locations. And this is the one really bad example that I consistently run into. When this hardpoint is active, one team is spawning right behind that hardpoint in the nice anchor point, and that's obviously the spawn that you want to have. That's always going to be the most beneficial spawn. Whereas the other team is often spawning literally on the exact opposite side of the map. And this is one of the bigger maps that we currently have access to in the beta. That is a long run for you to get back toward the hardpoint in the fight, and that absolutely shouldn't be taking place. That team should be spawning much closer to where that hardpoint location is, and even when doing that, it still wouldn't necessarily be the beneficial spawn. You would still probably want to anchor behind that spawn point in the same area, and that would still have the advantage. But as of right now, that's more than just a slightly advantageous spawn. That's an extremely advantageous spawn, since enemies will spawn out so ridiculously far away. So again, that's something where I'm pretty sure once they see the data when it comes to spawns, they'll be making some adjustments there. Stuff like that is probably pretty obvious when the data pops up. And that right there is going to wrap it up for my feedback video when it comes to spawns so far within the first weekend of the Black Ops 6 beta. Overall, like I said at the beginning, I'm quite disappointed in the current state of spawns in this game, and it really doesn't feel like Treyarch spawns at all, unfortunately. And I'm just really hoping that with the data they collect throughout the beta, they'll be able to make a bunch of appropriate changes to the spawn system to get things in a much better place, so that we can have significantly better flow and pacing with our matches. Now, of course, these are all just my thoughts and opinions on the spawns so far in the first weekend of the beta for Black Ops 6, and this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. What has your experience been like so far during this beta when it comes to spawns? Have you also been having a pretty big issue with the spawns in this game, or not so much? You think they're pretty much fine as is? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.